Tonight, government's big hiring freeze. It is a big deal because it doesn't come with a certain three-letter word called net freeze. We're going to explain that pretty shortly, but it's all part of what we understand to be the end game for getting the IMF program. If you read the budget, some of the things in there gives you a clue as to what our homegrown program that the IMF is going to use to give us the bailout will look like. And this is one of them. Is it a necessary evil, right? Think about it for a second. When government says we're no longer going to employ anybody into the public and civil service, just like that, that throws up a host of challenges. But why is it that we've had to do this? Let's go through this. As I walk through, you understand why this is, but also give a certain historical context and how much this will mean for Ghana and our economy going forward with this IMF negotiations that we're having. First of all, if you listen to the budget that was presented by the finance minister, you would get the sense that this is an outright freeze with no exception. But there's one exception. The exception is where there is a critical case to be made, then they will consider to employ. But then the question then arises, what is very critical and who defines that? How will the agency requiring the employment justify that they have a critical need that requires employment, and who will adjudicate on this to make the final decision? Yes, it is critical, employ. No, it is not. So it just throws up a whole host of challenges to the way we've employed already. In effect, it will put a freeze on all employments, right? In the past, when we've gone to the IMF, this is the last time we went to the IMF, there was a small caveat called net freeze, which in essence just simply says that you will not employ unless the incumbent employee has exited employment. In other words, if the person goes on pension, if the person resigns, retires, dies, whatever it is that gets him to vacate his post permanently, then you replace. That is a net freeze. Then you replace. That was the IMF condition. Well, not an IMF condition, but that is what we proposed to the IMF. IMF, of course, prodded us, and we agreed in 2015 when we got the last deal. That was manageable then, because then, of course, you have a situation where there are gaps, right, in a sector. So take the health sector. A doctor working in a public service, in a public hospital, who retires or who resigns or for whatever reason vacates his post permanently. Under the 2015 program, the government would have hired somebody to replace him. But under this, that won't happen unless that agency can prove that it's a very critical case that's been made. And so that throws up a whole different, but there's a reason for this. Where we are currently, where our economy is currently, it's unprecedented. This country have never witnessed such economic rot before. And so we are in uncharted territory, not business as usual. Nothing is normal anymore. And hence we are having to face unprecedented measures that will impose a lot of pain on sectors, on people, etc. Because you can imagine when the doctor isn't there and you have to replace immediately, but you can't. You have to now go and justify that it's critical, the time that, you know, the gap there, what happens to the patients who need critical care immediately. So there are a lot of questions there that we need to interrogate. We need to save the economy, but in doing so, how many lives possibly are we going to possibly have to compromise to achieve that? So very serious fundamental questions we intend to probe as far as this issue is concerned. But why is government having to do this? Because the fundamental challenge we are facing are twofold. One is compensation, the burden of the wage bill on the economy and what we're paying to investors as an interest rate to service our debt. So if you isolate compensation for employees, for example, for 2023, government is projecting to spend 44.99 billion cedis to pay workers, right? And this is an increase from 35 billion. The interesting thing that I'm noticing, if you look at the data from previous IMF programs or periods when we went to the IMF, it appears to be the very first time we're going to the IMF that we're going to see such a significant increase in the wage bill nonetheless. That in itself is an interesting point, but that's not why we're here tonight. So that problem is why government says, let's put a freeze on employment. The hope is that when you do that, then you're going to control the wage bill. You're not going to reduce it. You will control it. You're not going to increase it beyond what you are projecting. You just keep it constant. But is that enough? Is a key question to ask. How much of a dent will that make to the current crisis that we're having? And again, you look at the wages, salaries, question. If you break this down from the 44.99 billion, we're talking about wages and salaries, social contributions amounting to 38 billion cedis. And then pensions will take, and other payments will take the rest of the 6.26 billion cedis that's there. That's gives you the total of 44.99 billion, right? So that's a total. The government said this is too big. We've always known that. There's something wrong with our wage bill that keeps on draining everything else out. Immediately we put it in. But the other thing that I want you to draw attention to, that we've tried to chart, is what had happened during IMF program periods and non-IMF program periods when it comes to the wage bill, right? The adjustments of the employees and the change, percentage change in how much government is spending on wage. If you look at, so what you see in red there will be what they spent on during the time of IMF bailout. This key here is wrong. It's supposed to be a blue, but I would walk you through, which is what this is one of the things that we know. But I'll walk you through it. If you come to 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, this all IMF period, right? We're in IMF program. You'll begin to see that the wage bill increase, the cumulative increases were recorded. So from 15, right? From 15, 16, 18, and then they begin to drop in 2018 and 2019 when we just exited the last IMF program. And then you come to 2020 when there was no IMF program, right? When there was no IMF program. Then you see that the wage bill percentage increase jumped to 27%. So you were free now, after you exited the IMF program, to come back to a place where you can begin to pay workers more. That's why we saw this huge jump in the percentage change in the wages that we're paying to paying to workers in the public and civil servants from 13 to 27%. Then you're getting into 2021, where the red signs as far as the economy is concerned began to blink. And then you begin to see the percentage change is a steep drop, right? 13% increase was pretty small, and then you go to 2022, and then what government is projecting to spend now in 2023 is 25% increase in the wage bill from this year. Now, the interesting thing I want you to pay attention to is this projected increase, this 25% increase, is projected at the time when government hasn't agreed yet how much percentage they are going to add on for workers for 2023. They haven't agreed the base pay. Workers are asking for a 60% increase in your salaries. Government is offering 12%. They haven't reached an agreement, but the government has presented a budget and is projecting to spend 44.99 billion cedis, which represents a 25% increase in the wage bill if you compare to this year. The question is, what percentage increase in salary? Obviously, government is planning to spend more on salaries and wages, right? But what percentage did the government use in arriving at the 44.99 billion projection when they have not agreed an increase, a percentage increase with the workers? So that is a very interesting dynamic. And I wonder when the workers themselves, the TUC who will join us, when they look at the numbers, can they hazard a guess what percentage government has used to calculate this 44.99 billion cedis they plan to spend on wages? It's definitely not 60%. It can be. If it's 60%, it will be way higher than 44.99%, right? It's even not 40%, not 30%. We are guessing it's anything between 10 and 20%. 10 and 20%, which is what government has used in computing this 44.99 billion they plan to spend the next year, which represents a 25% increase in the wage bill from this year going to 2023. So the workers will give me their reaction to this, because this tells them where government, they already projected, right? And when you do projections, you don't want to exceed that, because it will blow the budget completely out of kilter. So this is possibly the upper limit government can contain in 2023. It tells you something. Government has already decided in their heads what they plan to give the workers. We'll get the workers to give us a sense of this, while employment will also remain the same. But then the big question, you're putting a freeze on employment because you don't want to, blow your, your wage bill out of gear, right? So how many workers are already in the system and you plan to remain constant? 700,000 of them include doctors, teachers, nurses, and other workers, right? So going for the next 3 years, I must add, government is saying we won't employ any more teachers, we won't employ any more doctors, we won't employ any more nurses, and a whole host of other public and civil servants. The key question is, will they employ more people at the office of government machinery, the presidency, etc.? Will they bring in all political hands more there and keep the doctors' numbers constant? That is always where the tension has been. But that is the whole idea of a freeze on employment. The TUC has been reacting to this. And something caught my attention what the TUC says. Apparently, the TUC has an agreement with government when they were agreeing that meager 4 and 7% increase in your salaries, in your wages, for 2022 and for 2021 and 2022, a condition for them agreeing this was that you will continue to employ young people into the public service. If that is true, then possibly this latest agreement to freeze employment may be in violation of that agreement. But I also asked that if this condition, right, was based on a 2021-2022 7 and 4% increase, then possibly that agreement that expires at the end of this year, so it doesn't apply to 2023. We'll get the TUC to give me a sense of what they think of that. And then if you go back to 2025, if you don't learn from history, it's difficult to appreciate how you can succeed going forward. And this country is a country that keeps almost every 5 years on the average, we go back to the IMF, because we really don't learn from what we've done in the past in running down the economy, going back to the IMF, taking the prescriptions, getting back on our feet only to fall again. So if you go back to 2015 IMF program, similar measures were introduced. More extensively, we had payroll cleanup, because there were a lot of ghost names. We've done systematically over the period using biometric, worker, staff data, etc., to clean it up. It was an IMF condition then. I mean, IMF condition is such an outmoded expression now, but it was part of the deal to get the IMF program. Also, bring the wage bill to revenue ratio down by 53 to 35%. I don't know where we are currently on this, so I'll leave that. But then freeze on public sector employment was another one. So does that ring a bell? Does it sound similar? Does it sound familiar to you? Yes, it is in the 2023 budget as well. So the prescriptions are known when we are going to the IMF. It happened in 2015. In 2015, there was also an addition of a freeze on public sector wage increases, which was very contentious by itself. We're not seeing that now. But here is where the controversy really lies. You are putting a freeze on public and civil, service employment freeze for public and civil servants. But is that where the problem really is in terms of the burden on the wage bill, right? Let's break this down. Article 71 office holders, the average Article 71 office holder is taking 18,000 CDs, 18,211 CDs average. The average civil servant on the single spine salary structure is taking 1,128 CDs. Look at the difference, 17,000 CDs. So the bedding, is it fair to say it's on civil and public servants, and so you are holding them constant for the next 3 years and not employing even when people retire, they go on pension, resign, or are sacked? So you will replace until they can justify that there's a critical reason for it, especially if you look at these numbers according to the 2020 Emoluments Committee. If you look at the highest earner for Article 71 office holder, they are taking home 29,000 CDs, right? This is it, the highest. And the single, spine salary structure is 4,000, right? And then you go to the least earner, 11,000, and you come to 127. This is as of 2016, I must emphasize. So just put that in context. This is as of 2016. And so let's put that in context, right? These numbers have changed over time, but we're looking at the 2016 numbers to make the argument here. And as you move forward into the current circumstance, these numbers don't change. The gaps, the disparity don't change. It's huge still. But we are dealing with the 2015, 2016 case, right? So that's what we have here. And in real terms, you talk about the what we saw in the 2017, 2020 reports. These are jaw-dropping numbers if you put this before any civil and public servant. So keeping them honest tonight, yes, we are freezing employment, but are we sharing the burden equally across the board in saving this economy as we approach the IMF? Let's have an honest conversation about this with the workers themselves and interrogate this going forward here on PMS just after the break. My guest tonight, Joshua Ansah, who's become something of my friend on the show. He's a Deputy Secretary General of the Trades Union Congress. Joshua, I'm grateful that you join us again for PM Express. This is a very important conversation indeed. Professor Ebo Texing, I invited Prof because I really wanted to work out the numbers, why this has become so critical, and whether government can do without it going to the IMF. Knowing all the history I've just talked about, he's Associate Professor of Development Economics at the University of Ghana. Prof, thank you very much. And in the studio with me is Dr. Justice Yankson. One of the most critical sectors when it comes to the labor force, doctors obviously. So when I saw, except in very critical cases, the only profession that came to mind was, the medicine, the medical profession. So he's the Vice President of the Ghana Medical Association. But let's start with you, Mr. Ansah. Mr. Ansah, let me start with you because at the TUC, you've already been raising concerns about this net freeze. I've seen your argument is that you had an agreement with the government, if I'm not mistaken, that when you are agreeing to the 4% and 7% base pay increase, there's a condition that they will continue to employ young people. Is that the case? Please unmute for me. Yes.
Hear me now, Evans.
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Evans. I think that is exactly the case. Before the 7% and the 4% was agreed, that were the conditions that were attached to it. That one, the government will continue to employ the young ones into the employment. Number two, all Ghanaians were going to be immunized. Number three, our tier 2 pensions were going to be paid. So these are some of the conditions attached to the agreement of the 4% and the 7%.
Okay. So government has announced now, as part of the IMF program, that there's going to be a net, not a net freeze, because that makes a huge difference, but this is a complete freeze, except in critical cases. Have you since gotten any additional detail on what this means and for your workforce?
Evans, thank you very much. I think that before I even answer that question, I want to register that the Trade Union Congress of Ghana, that's Ghana TUC, has never supported Ghana going into the IMF. We have always almost opposed to Ghana going to IMF because we have always suffered for its implications. Workers have never benefited from any IMF program Ghana has ever assented to. So this very one, before this program began and before the government assigned to this 2023 IMF program, I think there was some kind of consultation. The IMF team actually visited our office when they asked of our opinion about this IMF program, which we told them categorically that they know our position on IMF, that we never support any IMF program because there are consequences on workers. But we also reiterate our point that the things we fear about this IMF program is their conditionalities. And we know that the moment Ghana goes into this IMF program, there's going to be this issue about employment, issue about reduced salary, issue about negative things on workers. So you make it categorically clear to the team that these are the issues we are opposing to. That is why we don't want IMF program. But once government has taken a position, nobody can stop him. So government has gone into this IMF program, and lo and behold, the freezing of employment in the public and the civil service sectors have come to being. This is a complete total freeze on employment, unlike the previous one where it was a net freeze. But who determines what is critical? Who determines what is critical in this very country? So it's a complete total freeze. And we are expecting that details of the meaning of that total freeze must come. Yesterday, the TUC had its discussions on we actually digested the budget at a meeting. And there was no detail about the freeze, whether it's a net freeze or half freeze or whatever. So all what has appeared in the budget statement is that there's a total freeze on employment in 2023, which the TUC opposes vehemently because you know that's going to have a very negative effect in this very country. Ghana is over 30 million plus, and only 700 people, like the doctors, nurses, teachers, and the people you mentioned in your intro, are the people who are providing services to service this 30 million plus in this very country. So if a government says it's freezing employment in 2023, we can guess what is going to happen in 2023. Assuming even 1 or 2% of this total 600, 700 workforce resigns or retires or by some reasons, leave the job. What is going to happen to the public sector, public service? It means our services is going to be affected. So the total freeze on employment, Master Evans, is totally unacceptable, and we are highly disappointed about this program.
Okay. And by the way, let me come to Justice Yangsing. What we are talking about, if you put in the context of IMF program, will last at least for 3 years. Exactly. Because once we sign on to it, it's a freeze for 3 years.
Exactly.
Look at the health sector where you operate. Can you afford not to employ new doctors for the next 3 years?
That would be disastrous for us as a country. I mean, the reasons are very simple. We have a population that keeps growing in terms of the national population. As we speak, doctor-patient ratio is not one that you can boast of because we are way off the WHO standards. People are going to resign. People are already leaving the country as we speak. People are going to retire. Unfortunately, being a human institution, some will even have to go off because they are unwell. If you couple this with the fact that we have gone on an aggressive Agenda 111 projects in the health sector, which are also expected to be manned, I can't see how the current workforce, beyond all the descriptions that I have given, can be redistributed to man all these areas. Naturally, we will all be burnt out. Service delivery is going to be compromised. So as far as we are concerned, this business of no employment in the health sector in particular, and if we go down and we talk about doctors, there's going to be a disaster.
But do you have any hope, though? Because if you see the except in very critical cases, and Anybody will look at that and immediately think health sector.
You see, I am not part of the negotiations that are ongoing with the IMF. But I think that the people leading that agenda now will definitely have to ensure that that little window, very critical, when we come to the form or the nature of the definition, it should, as a matter of urgency, include the health sector. As it is now, it's a bit vague in the sense that, as Joshua said, who determines critical? And beyond that, it's been qualified, very critical. Is it at the whims and caprices of, in quotes, the number one man of the state? Is it at the level of a minister or who? But if we are going to sign on to, just as we saw in 2015, where we had at least a very broad or clear-cut definition which said health education were exempted.
Okay.
I think that that is the nature of the agreement we should be looking at. That is not to say, in principle, we endorse this whole arrangement where nobody is to be employed. But if we really have to go on that tangent, the exceptions will have to be clear, it will have to be broadened properly, and for us, at all costs, it must include the health sector.
Do you at least understand why government needs to do this?
Well, you see, it's very difficult to try and speak for governments. I think they should be answering these questions. But if you look at the general context, the fact that, government wants to find a way out of the crisis, then maybe one may think that they are trying to see if a net freeze or if there's a total freeze on employment, then between now and whatever period that ultimately will exit. Because sometimes you can sign on to a 3-year program, and depending on what is happening, we've seen countries who couldn't exit within the period. Yeah. Then maybe it will be a way of trying to bring down the compensation component of our entire, GDP and the expenditure that are related to the GDP. That way, I think that if we are to, in quotes, just think and walk a certain path, that, just keep freezing without also analyzing the impact on us, socially and economically, I think we might get it wrong.
Professor Texting, how much of a difference would this make, if at all, to where we are currently and our economic survival?
Thank you, and good evening to your viewers. I think that we are at a point where certain difficult choices have to be made. And anytime we get to this point, that has always been the justification that we are in a mess and we need to get out of the mess. And there are a whole lot of issues that confront our economy at the moment. Our failure to raise enough domestic revenue, and the fact that we have a very rigid expenditure structure that is almost making it impossible for us to run those fiscal deficits. So at the center of this problem is the need for us to reduce the rigidities in the budgets, because earmark funds and compensation and net interest, as at the end of 2020, was 144% of our domestic revenue. And this is not a good sign. So 2 ways: either you increase the revenue or keep the expenditure there, or do both. Increase domestic revenue and try to see the extent to which you can reduce and rationalize your expenditure, especially with the rigidities, because in all of this, we don't even provide enough resources for expanding the domestic capacity of the economy to be able to create more jobs and employ. Now, one of the main reform packages that will always be on the board when we go for IFM reforms will be the public sector. Now, as at the end of this year, the compensation to public sector employees as a percentage of our GDP is almost 39.3, almost 40% of our GDP. When you compare that to what we are expecting next year, which might slightly drop. So in doing this, what do? You can say, okay, let me freeze public sector employment. It's a cost to the country. But the freezing of public sector employment doesn't mean that when people go on retirement or resign, we cannot replace them. I don't think the freeze means that you cannot replace when they leave.
Yeah, but Prof, I know you say that, but the wording in not the budget statement that was read, but if you look at the actual budget document, it is categorical that it freeze and it creates an exception. Only in critical cases can you employ.
Yes, let me go back to that, because in 2015, that was exactly what happened. Now, the critical areas has always been health and education, because in those areas, we don't even have enough public sector workers to man the health facilities and then the education institutions. So even if there's going to be a freeze there, I work in a university. I remember those times, the university will come up and say, okay, they've given us 20 slots because 20 people have gone on retirement or resigned. So Legon has been giving 20 slots. Maybe economics, you have 2 slots. If you have people who want to apply, come and fill in that gap. I'm expecting the government to do same. I'm not expecting the government to freeze public sector employment and say that nobody will be employed even when others are resigning or are retiring. We cannot do that, because at worst, we need to maintain the number of public sector employees that we have and not necessarily increase the numbers. One thing that we've done, and in 2019, when the IMS was leaving, I mentioned in one of the interviews that we need to keep the freeze on the public sector employment, because we cannot go on increasing the size of the public sector, especially for some of the agencies, where we part them with party functionaries, some of which you know if you have jobs to do where they are. We cannot go on. We need to create an economy where it's the private sector that is generating the employment for the teeming youth that leave our universities and tertiary education. It is not a public sector thing. We need to move beyond public sector employment by enabling the environment for the private sector to create jobs. Because we cannot do the two things at the same time. We cannot keep on padding the public sector, increasing the wage bill, running huge levels of expenditure, and we cannot even collect enough taxes because people have already been overburdened with taxes. How do we run? Then we need to borrow. We borrow, our debts become unsustainable, and then we get to this point. So there are difficult choices that we need to make. And the choices that we need to make, at times as we go through a reform like that, we need to freeze public sector employment. I'm talking from the economic point of view. I would want to see the TUC be on government to create the enabling environment for the private sector to expand and employ, but not for the TUC to say, no, we want you to employ more, and yet we don't collect enough revenue. It's important. I mean, for health, for education, fine. There is no reason why we should freeze. But even that one, we should rationalize and make sure that we are being very efficient at employing and make sure that people are productive on the job. Because when we are productive and we increase output, that in itself as a percentage of GDP will decline to levels. Look, Ghana has one of the highest compensation as a percentage of GDP or revenue in Sub-Saharan Africa. To be honest with you.
And why is
the average is about 28%. We are always above it.
Yeah, but Prof, the question to why is it because the numbers, we have too many staff on the wage bill, or we are paying our workers far more than the other countries?
That is not the case. There are two reasons why. There are at times ghost names on our public sector payroll.
But we've been cleaning that. Also a good issue. We've been cleaning that since before the first. We clean when
the IMF goes. When we clean when the IMF goes, the ghost names come back. Okay. Go and look at the last. The public accounts that the Auditor General submitted. Go and look at the ghost names. If you are the Ministry of Finance, I mean, so we have them come back when the IMF leaves. So that is one of the problems. We need to clean the public sector payroll. 2, we have these Article 71 holders who are also paid huge compensations. And that is also part of the public sector wage bill. And so if you are rationalizing, for instance, do we need the number of ministers that we have, or we can cut them down? Because if you take one minister's salary and you compare it to somebody on the single spine structure, you see the difference.
Yeah.
So can we cut down on the size of the executive so that we do some savings? So that if you are going to freeze the amount of money that we pay to public sector, once you are reducing one end, we can use it to employ in the critical areas of the economy, like education and health.
Yeah, I mean, stay with me, Prof.
It's something that we need to discuss, and we need to take a critical look at it.
Stay with me, Prof. I mean, Joshua, so that is the economic argument for this. It says the TUC support government to, push to increasing production and the revenues, etc. But in essence, there's a real hard economic argument for this freeze.
Yes, there are good arguments for the freeze.
No,
I cannot pretend that.
Sorry, Prof. I want to put that to Joshua with the TUC. Okay. Joshua?
Can you hear me, Evans?
Yes, I can.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks, Professor, for his economic view about the whole thing. But I want to ask, is it the afterthought or that is his own thinking about the statement made in the how do you call it, the budget statement? Because the budget statement has stated categorically what it intends to do. But from the explanation Prof is giving, it's like an advice or something that government should consider. For us in TUC, we know that that is a definite statement made by the statement that there's going to be employment freeze in public sector and that. So if Prof is asking TUC to push the government to actually create the enabling environment for private sector to thrive, it's neither here nor there, because the TUC, I mean, what power do we have to actually push the government to create the enabling environment for the private sector? It is the duty of the government, who is governing this country socially and economically, to know that if the private sector is the engine of growth, if that is where employment can be generated, that is where it should channel its energy to. But I'm happy about the last statement by the Prof about if they want to cut costs. The cutting of costs doesn't come with the freeze. How much are you going to save when you freeze employment? But if you even reduce your government size by half, look at the savings that you make to actually use that savings to do things like social improvement for the lives of the people of this very country. So I think that still stand by the statement in the budget that freezing of employment for the next 2023 to the next 3 years is something that we cannot contain in this very country, and the government must do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you say that a lot, but I wonder, what can the TUC do about this? It's already in the budget.
Yes, we are going to actually digest it seriously, and like you said, if it is going to be considered in a way that when people resign or retires or something, they are going to play, government should come clean and let us know. If government machinery is able to explain all this to us, then that is put into the context of discussions. Then during the discussions, as the Prof said, we can all consider the situation in which we find ourselves. But it's not for TUC to decide for the government what the government should do to ensure that this country is governed the way you want. It is his duty. That is why we have voted for him. That's why we have given all our money to him. That's why we expect that economically and socially, the government must take care of the citizenry of this very country. But freezing employment in this country, my brother, is unacceptable to us as TUC.
Just as the Prof makes the economic argument about why this is important, there's an economic reason for it. He's expecting that the critical areas will obviously include the health sector and then teachers. Although I must clarify that in 2015, in the budget that was read after the IMF program, the wording was very clear. And just to quote it for the avoidance of doubt, 2015, continuation of the policy of net freeze on employment into all sectors of the public services, excluding education and health, and non-replacement of departing public sector employees in overstaffed areas, end of quote. So that is very clear, and exceptions were there. They broke it down, education, health. This year, it is, quote, there is a freeze on recruitment into the civil and public service, except in very critical areas. So it's categorical and clear-cut and closed.
Wait,
basically, this is why Joshua is saying that we should not conjecture at this point. The wording for 2015-2016 speaks for itself. The wording for the current position is such that it is very difficult to really go out there, stick your neck out and say that, look, very critical means education and health. It is not stated that way. That is why I said earlier that, as far as I'm concerned, that very critical, in the context of the negotiations with the IMF, we need to get it properly defined. And there are some key areas we, of necessity, will have to mention clearly so that there's no ambiguity.
So your demand is that necessarily health sector must be included in the
of course, the real health professionals. They will have
doctors,
to be
nurses, and like
pharmacists.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can't do your work as a doctor without.
I mean, laboratory professionals are also part of it. So clearly, we need to get these people in.
So there must be a group that is exempt. I mean, there must be exemptions.
Yeah, just like we had in
2015.
Just like we had in 2015. Okay. You see, the principle is that generally nobody is happy about the fact that people are going to be unemployed. Yeah. We all want our friends, our family members, and what have you, the younger ones, to get employment. But if under these very difficult economic circumstances, we are forced to bite the bullet, we cannot close the door completely on all sectors. Because the very critical ones like health, as we are defining, and as we have also seen in previous times, we had that formula, and at least for nothing at all, it worked. Yeah. It saved all of us. It was very difficult because when people are not coming in, the already overburdened, stressed, burnt out health professionals continue to suffer. What we don't see is that it also has negative implications on the outcomes of their work. Because when somebody is burnt out, look, I tell you what, there are bound to be errors. So it's an area that of necessity must be included in this whole conversation.
But we are in desperate times.
Yeah, we are in desperate times. And desperate times means that we have to get desperate measures.
Yeah, but this is one.
Yes,
this is one desperate measure.
But it does not mean that we should sign our death warrant as a country. If you don't, look, as they say, the wealth of a country depends on the health of that country. So if your health sector, through such a policy, in quote, will come to a halt, or is not going to function effectively, what wealth are you going to create? And how are you going to get out of the mess?
But do you need such a significant employment list for the next 3 years in the health sector? See, talking about doctors alone, do we really need
Evans,
that many?
You see, let me use Agenda 111. Yeah. Within Agenda 111, there are 88 districts without hospitals. Evans, this day and age, do you think that it is fair and equitable for a whole district to exist without any hospital to take care of their health needs?
No.
And if you are building a hospital, as in the structure, to call it a hospital properly so-called, you need doctors to
On the average, how many doctors do you need per hospital?
Well, it depends on the size of the hospital and the kinds of activities that happen there. I mean, for example, for a place like Kolebu, which is at the highest level, you can imagine.
The typical district hospital will have how many doctors?
Well, I mean, if you see the current designs for district hospitals, so you have, let's say, the key areas, pediatrics, you have what we call medical, as in the physician's job, medical block, that kind of medicine. Then we have surgical, we have obstetrics and gynae. These are the 4 key areas. Beyond that, we have the primary care components that are also thrown in there. So you would need to have at least personnel to man all these areas, including specialists. Mind you, for the structure we are running, the district hospitals sit at the pinnacle of the primary healthcare delivery system. And here we are talking about universal health coverage. Beyond that, because we have lagged some of the very top level activities, these district hospitals, in most times, double up as secondary level caregivers. So it is not too simple to just say that you have 10 or you have 1. Most of them are understaffed because we don't have the numbers. But
is it because the schools are not producing enough doctors, or the doctors simply are leaving? It's a combination of factors.
Well, it's a combination of factors. One, the doctors are poorly paid.
Okay.
Let's be honest with ourselves. Very poorly paid. So when people see the reality on the ground, some are ready to migrate. And as we speak, doctors and other health professionals are leaving. You can decide to say whether they are patriotic or otherwise. That is your choice, but they are
That's
gone.
the reality.
That's the reality. Two, the population keeps expanding. Over the years, we have never been able to get that critical base. So you realize that it's like a catch-up kind of activity. We are trying to catch up and make up for the shortfalls in the numbers. The schools, I must say, are now doing their best because the turnover compared to when I was in school is massive now. When I was in school, my whole class was 65. If you add the dental bit, 75. And at the time, it was the highest ever.
I see.
And it was just University of Ghana, as in Kolebu, Legon, that structure, and then Konfo-Anoche. But now, even within these two schools, you have a threefold, almost fourfold increase. You also have what we call the graduate entry programs, which are also different from what we used to run the pure undergrad throughout. And then other new schools have come in. So Cape Coast is on board, Tamale is on board, Ho is on board. We have 2 private medical universities. The numbers that are also coming in from outside the country, people being trained.
Yeah, you saw the case of...
Yeah, so clearly the numbers are going up. But of course, if you are not able to sustain and contain them within the system, then as you train, they leave.
And where the public sector is where they need the most.
Yes, because you see, we run a special activity as a country. Our constitution mandates that the state has to ensure that we get the best quality care, at least at whatever levels. The definition of best quality care might be a bit debatable, but all it tells you is that the constitution wants the state to ensure that we are properly taken care of. So at all levels of the society, we need to have health professionals who can take care of.
So you're making an important point. You're saying that already as it is today, your numbers aren't enough.
Yes.
In fact, you need more doctors
We
now,
need more.
not less. And then,
Yes.
and then now you put in the context of freezing it for 3 years.
Yes.
That makes the situation...
Go to a place, say, like the Upper East region, and go and check the number of doctors out there.
Okay. But that's a very interesting proposition. And you touched on something I want to bring the Tuesday and bring in before I end with Prof, which is that doctors are poorly paid. That brings up the base pay conversation.
Yeah.
Because this is also relevant to this. Joshua, let me ask you, the base pay conversation, and remember that government is doing all this so that they reduce the burden, right? You didn't finish the base pay conversation before the budget was read. But the government has a projected number when it comes to how much they plan to spend on salaries next year in $44 billion series. Do you have an agreement with the government already which was factored into this projection?
Very strange. Strangely, we haven't had any agreement with government. So, you see, these are some of the things government do, and they think that the TVC is becoming stubborn or something. The law says that negotiate salaries for the following year by the end of April. Then you can read your budget in November. We have sat down from April to November. We couldn't reach an agreement on the base pay negotiations, and the budget has been read. Because when we post the 60%, government also came out with 15%, which we rejected outright. So if that has been rejected and have asked that they should go for a fresh mandate, and you have gone ahead to put some figure in the budget, then it means you have already made up your mind to put a certain percentage in the budget.
Yeah.
So if you have put the percentage in the budget and you come to negotiations and there's no agreement, what happens? You have already started creating problem.
Do you are there any plans for future negotiations, and when is this?
No, tomorrow. We received this an invitation this afternoon that continuation of the base pay negotiations is tomorrow. And we hope that when we meet tomorrow, something good may come out. Otherwise, it's going to continue like that.
But Joshua, I need to be frank about this. There's already a number in the budget. I mean, it's projected. There's no way government is going to exceed that projected number.
Oh, okay. Then there's no way organized labor is also going to accept what has been put in the budget. Because if the government has made up its mind that if that is the way he thinks he can actually force something down the throat of workers, then we are in for a big fight. Because there's no way that government can pay anything below what we are expecting. Because if you go and put 15%, this 44 billion, what does it translate to in percentage-wise? And on what basis are you going to start calculating your percentage? You have put 44 billion in the budget. We don't know how much percentage it translates to. You are now going to meet organized labor to discuss the base pay, which is already poor, which is already indecent. For all these years, the pay has been very, very indecent. If I tell you the pay of people on the base,
the last time you read it for
yes,
me,
I thought, yes.
Yeah, just I need to ask you about that. I mean, I know you're also interested in this. Are you part of the negotiations at all?
Well, I've always been part, except that this year in particular, I haven't attended.
They're going back tomorrow.
Yeah, no, we are actually there as doctors, except that my person, I haven't been there this year because I've been busy with other things as well.
I mean, but have you ever seen it before where there's a number in the budget when we haven't agreed?
Well, you see,
never.
You see,
never.
These are some of the problems that sometimes we create for ourselves. We had a whole period within which we could have sorted these things out. We waited to the last end, and now you can see that we're on a collision course. It's clear from what Joshua is saying that Labour will never accept certain things to be forced down their throats. So most likely we are going to go on a collision course. Is that fair to all of us? I think sometimes it's the way we go about handling the situations. I can agree, government is under pressure to fix the problems, but Labour is also under pressure to sort their micro-level problems. There's a macro and there's a micro.
I've been to before pressure. I have to eat before I can work.
So it's a very dicey situation, but ultimately, I think Labour expects that we'll also go home with what is decent and what can keep us going. We all know the economic indices and how they're affecting everybody. In real value terms, I have lost over 60% of the value of my
inflation, depreciation,
all those bits. So
and whatever you have invested, everything is gone.
So if people have actually more or less been compelled under the circumstances to fall on their little savings and it's all been dissipated, and then going forward, these problems are also not over. They are not going to get anything decent. How are you expecting them to go to work? So it's going to be a very difficult.
Prof, wrap it up for me, please.
I think it's very unfortunate the government didn't conclude negotiations with the TUC to incorporate that in the budget. And like Dr. Youngson said, these are the sort of things that bring unnecessary confrontation. The labor unions are a critical stakeholder in this economy. And we know public sector employees play a critical role in supporting whatever development we are trying to churn out. And I think that it's not good if already a projected level of compensation has been determined in the budget without coming to conclusion with labor unions. That in itself at times also becomes part of the issue. So when we move into 2023 and labor unions negotiate and get a higher percentage rise than was projected in the budget, then our expenditure overruns its budget.
Yeah.
And then our revenues, we don't meet them. So our fiscal consolidation that we seek to do, we don't meet them. And then credit rating agencies downgrade us. And then the problem starts. We need to stop this firefighting approach. It is not right. We know what is right. If the negotiation should have taken place in April, the decision should have been made by mid of this year.
Yeah.
But this is the agreement that we have with the public sector employees. And so on the basis of this percentage, this is what we are projecting in the budget. So now we are currently, then there's an issue for us to talk about. How realistic are expenditure rationalization that we've indicated as one of the key pillars? How realistic are revenue projections? So I think that it is something that the government needs to take a look at. I think that communication for government should also be clear on the freeze. Because I've spoken about the freeze relative to what happened in 2015, and I think that should be what we should be moving towards.
The exceptions have to be clearly stated.
There should be enough the education for the labor unions to know that the freeze means that we replace We'll have critical areas in education and health where we'll try to rationalize the employment and so on and so forth. And I think when these things are done, all stakeholders will come to terms with our situation.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of
labor unions and others
a
are
bit of the
not,
confusion. And we had
this is
invited
about our situation.
We had invited government to clarify this very thing, and they turned down an invitation. So we're still hoping to get some clarity on this. But I wish all of you to go into the conversation tomorrow with the government, good negotiations. We'll see how this plays out, especially when, as I heard from Joshua, it's never happened before that a budget is read when there's no agreement on base pay percentage increase for the next year. So let's see how this pans out tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of the evening, people.